Do you remember your first job? Not the first time your parents bribed you to clean the house or mow the lawn or walk the dog, but your first time that you actually got paid by someone else to do something they thought was important enough to give you real money. I sure remember mine. I was in 7th grade, living in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I got a paper route. For 6 mornings a week, I was up before the dawn, rain, snow, or shine, had to get the papers delivered by 7 a.m., 6 days a week, 15 cents a paper. Yeah. I remember how proud I was when I got that job. I was now an official representative of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. Pretty impressive. And to make sure that everyone in the neighborhood knew that I was an official representative, I was given one of the most important tools of the journalism trade, and that, of course, was this very paperboy bag. Now, much to my wife's dismay, I still have this bag. I keep it in my office. It's a reminder to me of the humble beginnings of my career. It's also a reminder to me of what I learned as a 13-year-old kid. Important lessons about dedication and discipline and perseverance and not sneaking up on a dog in its yard from behind. Important lessons about coffee as well. That was my introduction. That job, that first job, taught me about responsibility. And you know what else it taught me? An important lesson of dignity. Before I had this job, I was just a regular 13-year-old kid. But after I got this job, I was a representative of one of the greatest newspapers in America. It said so right on the bag. That was me. Dignity. I had that. I've had a lot of jobs since then. You probably have too. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics tells us that the average number of jobs held in a lifetime is 13. I'm at 15 right now, and counting, I think. If you haven't guessed, this morning we're going to examine the concept of work. What is work? We have a new sermon series called The Everyday Plan, and once you reach a certain age, your everyday routine involves work. It's part of what it means to be a human being. When you hear the word work, what comes to mind? In our post-COVID world, the concept of work has been turned on its head. We now have gig work. We've got remote work. We've got all kinds of work scenarios that didn't exist even 5 years ago. Work looks different than it did when I was a kid. But work is also our impressions of work are often formed initially by our families. For me, I learned about work from my dad, who learned about it from his dad. My dad grew up in what we call a working class family. His father had a lot of jobs. He had 4 young mouths to feed. And so my dad's strongest memories of his father growing up were of him being gone because he was at work, or if he was at home, he was asleep because he was so tired from working all the jobs. First impressions from family. But then there are also some cultural stereotypes about work, aren't there? One of them is the stereotype of the dead-end job. The dead-end job. And so we have The Office. The laughable Dunder Mifflin staff in Scranton, led by the ridiculous Michael Scott, and they're all stuck in dead-end jobs, aren't they? And we laugh at that. The show captures the absurdity and the humanity of typical middle-class Americans showing up day after day after day, doing work that they sometimes like, but mostly they don't. But they've got to do it because they've got to make ends meet. We laugh at The Office, but none of us wants to end up at Dunder Mifflin for the rest of our lives, do we? That's the dead-end job. Instead of one of those jobs, we're told to look for our dream job, right? The dream job. People tell us, find a job you love and you'll never have to work a day in your life, right? We've all heard it. That's the job we want. That's the job we aspire to. But notice what's behind that quote. It implies if you love your work, well, it's not work. Real work is something you don't like to do. It's a burden. It's a responsibility. It's something that puts food on the table, but it certainly doesn't feed our souls. If you like it, that can't possibly be work. And of course, the only thing worse than having to show up for work every day that you don't like is not being able to show up for work because you don't have a job. And so we have the image from the Depression era of forlorn, out-of-work men who are filled with shame and humiliation because they can't provide for their families. How embarrassing. What could be worse? That's another stereotype. In the modern age, it wouldn't be this picture. It might be a foreclosed home or a bankrupt business. I don't know what image comes to your mind when you think about work, but this morning, I would like to challenge you to consider a different image, one that you've probably never thought about in the context of work, and that is this: the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden. How do you figure? Well, turn with me, if you will, in your pew Bibles to Genesis chapter 1. It's at the very beginning, page 2, I believe. It's also going to be on the screens. When we pick up the story at verse 26, we're almost at the end of the creation account. By this point, God has been hard at work. God's already created light, planet Earth, the seas and land, the sun, moon, and stars, and all the creatures of the sea. When we come to the sixth day, God starts it off by creating all the living creatures that move along the ground. For most of us, that's a full day. We'd call it enough. Call it quits after creating all the living creatures on the ground. But God has one more item on his work to-do list before the day is over, and we pick it up at verse 26, chapter 1. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. What an incredible statement. Created in the image of God. Author of Genesis, tell us more about this image of God. What is it like? We don't get the answer yet. We're left hanging a bit. At the very beginning, what's the image of God about? Well, if you read further in the book, spoiler alert, you'll learn a lot more about God's image. In the New Testament, you'll get a picture of what God looks like. It's the person of Jesus Christ. Just to make it clear, that's what God is like. But at the very beginning, what's our takeaway about the image of God? Well, Bible scholars tell us that in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, the term image of God was used to describe the king. The king embodied the image of God. It was a royal term that carried prestige and honor and authority. But that title was never applied to the canal digger. or to the mason who built the pyramid, or to the servant. And it certainly wasn't applied to a woman. That was radical. The author of Genesis makes the audacious claim that all of humanity is royal. All of humanity is related to God. All human beings, male and female, have dignity and value and importance. Adam and Eve, as the first humans, set the standard for every other human being to come. They're created with dignity. And guess what? That includes us as well. We have dignity and value because we are created in God's image. Let's continue. Verse 28. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." And then skipping to verse 31, God saw all that he'd made, and it was very good. There was evening, there was morning, the sixth day. And we all know what God did on the seventh day. God took a break. God rested. So the final act of God's creation, the crowning achievement at the end of the sixth day, was creating human beings in God's image, male and female. And, we're told, God then blessed them to go forth and multiply, to subdue the earth, and to rule over all the living creatures. Now, too often throughout history, the words subdue and rule have been used as an excuse to exploit and to dominate in God's name. And that is extremely unfortunate. It's probably also a mistranslation of the words. The Hebrew word for subdue simply means to till and to keep the land, to cultivate, to bring life out of the ground. That's what subdue means. And the word for rule doesn't mean to bring under submission at all costs. Instead, it's a royal term. Just like the term rule reflects royal language, image does as well. So, Old Testament scholar Victor Hamilton writes this: "What's expected of the king is responsible care over that which he rules. Humankind is created to rule, but this rule is to be compassionate and not exploitative. Even in the Garden of Eden, the one who would be Lord of all must be servant of all." At creation, God gives us the template of what servant leadership looks like. Not a king who rules with an iron fist, but a servant who oversees with care and compassion. And again, to connect the dots, reading on in Scripture, that image is fully embraced by the person of Jesus Christ, who we read later on came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So since the beginning of time, human beings have been created not only in God's image, but they have been created to serve on behalf of their Creator. And what do servants do? They work. Work in God's vocabulary is not a dirty word. It's not a four-letter word. It's a beautiful expression of the dignity and responsibility of sharing with God as God makes all things new. It shows trust, not domination. And that trust that God gives is tested right away. In the next chapter of Genesis, we learn that God gives Adam and Eve even more holy work to do. They get to name all the animals, and they get to tend the Garden of Eden. All of it, they're told, except for one tree. And what do? They can't resist. Instead of being gardeners, they want to be owners of the garden. They don't want to tend it, They want to control it. They crave the ownership. They want to be boss. They want to be in charge. And they quickly prove that they are not gods, but instead they are very much human. They are human beings. And to this day, that's what we say, isn't it, when we fall short? We say, well, I'm only human. That's not a confession. It's the truth. We were not created to be gods. We're created in God's image, but there's one God, and it's not us. As flawed, as imperfect as we are, God uses us to do God's holy work, just like Adam and Eve, human beings. So that's what the original plan, looked like in the Garden of Eden. But what about today? What does it mean to look for God's plan in our own everyday lives here and now? I've got one example. I was hired as mission pastor here 25 years ago. And one of the first things that I did, I got to meet our mission partners. One of our local partners was Calvary Church in the Whittier neighborhood. And so I was introduced to Pastor Jeff, who was the pastor of this diverse, multi-ethnic congregation in an aging building. And as I got to know Pastor Jeff over the years, he shared with me a dream that he and his wife, Randy, had, that one day they would like to expand their ministry beyond the walls of their church into the neighborhood, and they'd like to do it by finding storefront space to open a pub. A pub. And I thought to myself, really? You're pastoring a church, you're trying to keep the building from falling down, you're starting new ministries, and oh, yeah, you've got a family to raise, and you're going to start a pub. Good luck with that. Earlier this month, the Prodigal Pub celebrated their 5th anniversary. Pastor Jeff and his wife, Randy, wrote this about their vision. They write, "Throughout our decades together, we've celebrated life and relationships within our church by weaving hospitality, relationships, diversity, and justice seeking through the social fabric of our faith community. Now, all we believe about gathering people together for good is being extended to our pub. We've chosen the story of the prodigal son returning home and being celebrated with food and drink as an inspiration to welcome and celebrate all. The Prodigal Public House is a place for all people and a home for connections and reconnections. No matter where you've been or what you've done, you are welcome here." Pastor Jeff just retired from Calvary Church on Easter Sunday, but he is working harder than ever. He's found his dream job. He is part of God's everyday plan, being played out at the corner of 26th and 1st in South Minneapolis through the lives of two very human beings who simply had a vision to expand their ministry beyond the walls of a church and to bring it into the neighborhood. And God is using them to help recreate lives, to bring new life into places where there's death and depression and addiction and destruction. People who wouldn't step foot into a church building, but would come into a pub. Changing lives, one pint at a time. And you may think, okay, that's a nice story. I'm not going to open a pub. Thanks. Guess what? You don't have to. You don't have to open a pub. There are countless ways that all of us can reflect God's image and do God's work of sharing the good news with everyone, everywhere. And those of us on staff here, we get a front row view into how you folks are doing that. We get to hear about the student who decides she's going to take what she hears at church and put it into practice, even though she's busy with homework and sports and music. And so she befriends that new kid who looks a little different and doesn't have a friend group. She reaches out and makes a new friend. We hear about the retiree who has a friend who lives out of state, who he hasn't been in touch with for years, but he finds out his childhood friend is now in prison, serving time for a sex crime. And this guy decides, now would be a good time for me to reach out and rekindle that relationship. I think that guy needs a friend. We hear about the resident of the senior living facility who was widowed. And so she knows the pain of what it means to lose a spouse. And so she makes it her mission to reach out whenever she hears about a death in the community and offer a warm embrace and a word of love and compassion. We hear about the man whose friend is dying of kidney failure. And he decides, well, you know what? I think I'm going to donate my kidney. And when we asked him, he said, well, I had an extra one. It just seemed like the right thing to do. That's part of his everyday plan. We hear about the successful couple who very quietly and with no fanfare decide that they want to bless others extravagantly because they've been blessed so much. And their only rule is, please don't tell anybody else. We just want to do this for you. We hear about the grocery store cashier who makes it her mission to strike up a conversation with every customer. And then the regular ones, she begins to learn their stories, their names, their families, so that when she sees them, she can ask and show some care, some compassion. All of those, no matter what stage or age of life, no matter employment status, are people who've decided, you know what, there's a part for me in God's everyday plan. Doesn't have to be huge. When John F. Kennedy became president, American morale was at a low point because we were losing the space race. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, and shortly after JFK took office, the Russians put the first man in space, a cosmonaut. But then, shortly after Kennedy started, everything changed. On this very day, May 26th, 1961, newspapers across the country blared out this headline: Kennedy calls for moonshot. I'll have you know I did not deliver this paper. I wasn't born yet. But the day before, Kennedy had stood before Congress and he made this bold proclamation. He said that our country should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. That was an audacious statement. At the time, NASA was 2 years old and had a grand total of 15 minutes of manned spaceflight experience. NASA soon started building a new space center in Houston to accommodate all the brainiacs, all the engineers and the rocket scientists that they had to hire. And the story is told that a year after his announcement, Kennedy made his first visit to Houston, first visit to the NASA Space Center, was taking a tour when he noticed a man with a broom. He interrupted his tour and he walked over, he held out his hand and he said, "Hello, I'm Jack Kennedy. What do you do here at the Space Center?" And the janitor replied to him, "Mr. President, I am helping put a man on the moon." The janitor, not merely a janitor, but a part of the NASA space team. I don't know what excuse you have for not being part of God's plan. I'm just a single mom. I'm just a student. I'm retired. I just work a middle class job that I don't really like all that much. I'm a kid. I'm unemployed. Whatever it is, God knows it. And it does not exclude you. It never has. It never will. Because we have all, since the beginning of time, been created in God's image to play a role in God's incredible plan of bringing new life. And folks, I think that's the real dream job. When we get to do that work, that holy work, each and every day of our lives. What a privilege. What a privilege. As part of this sermon series,